Okay, let's get started. Right, that's right. So what we're going to do today is this sort of day's event is going to fall into two halves. The first session, so from now through to lunch, I'll be talking about, well, essentially how to write a paper. Yeah, so what constitutes a paper in an academic journal, and what do I think we need to consider in order to write a paper. So you can see here on the slide how to build and structure a paper. So what are the building blocks that make a paper? What makes for a strong introduction? So how we set a paper up. What makes for a compelling case? This is what I call whyness. So what are the issues that we need to consider when we write a paper to try and ensure that people find a paper of interest and importance and significance. How to make a case. So what do we mean by a case? How to integrate theory, how to use theory, and then how to write a conclusion. So the morning session is going to be how we organize a paper and what constitutes paper. And then after lunch, we're going to look at the actual reviewing process. So how you choose a journal, what are the things that you need to bear in mind, how you write the abstract, how you deal with referees, and so on. So essentially today's session is going to fall into the before lunch, which is the why questions, so why a paper, and after lunch, how. Yeah, so how we publish a paper. But as I say, if there are separate issues that you would like to discuss, you think would be useful, then please do interrupt, yeah, and just ask the questions. We don't have to stick to the script that I've got in front of me now. So I suppose you're kind of wondering why me? So what are my experiences that might link to this session? I've worked at universities in the UK, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. I work with scholars in the US, I'm in Thailand, Brunei, here in Vietnam at VNU in Hanoi. So I've had quite a lot of experience of working in different international universities and also working with scholars across the world. I'm a geographer, and I work with both scholars in the humanities, the arts, the social sciences, and also the natural sciences. So I'm not sure what departments you come from, you know, whether you are social scientists or in the humanities, but I've got friends and colleagues and collaborators who work across history, political science, development studies, earth science, anthropology, and so forth. I've reviewed promotion cases for scholars, US, Canada, France, Thailand, Singapore, New Zealand, Australia. So I've seen what are the standards for academics across the world. And I'm on the editorial boards of around about 10 international journals. So I've got, I think, a reasonable idea of where the bar is set when it comes to international journal authorship. And I mean, last thing to say on this slide, well, it was my birthday last week. I'm 65 years old, so I've been doing this for quite a long time. I've published, I don't know, 120 papers or something in international journals, and you can see there, I mean, they tend, you know, they get read by various people, they get cited. So as I say, I've worked in lots of universities, I've published with lots of scholars, and what I want to do today is try and bring some of the lessons that I've learned over the years to this event today and see if we can mutually learn from each other. Right, so this slide, as I said to begin with, do ask questions as we go along. If there are kind of particular issues that you find would useful to discuss, then let's do that. So don't feel that we, as I say, have got to stick to what we have on the screen. Yeah, we can go off in different directions according to what would be useful for you. Yeah, so I see my role here as to start the conversation going, and we can take it in the direction that would be most useful for you. And last thing before we kind of begin, I have no magic wand. I mean, I have papers rejected even after 40 years of writing and publishing. Yeah. I suppose one of the reassuring aspects of international journal publishing is its double-blind review. You don't know whose paper it is that you're reviewing normally. And I think even the most senior scholars get rejected. So it's worth kind of remembering that even if you're at the beginning of your career, those who are later in their careers still find themselves being rejected, and it's hard to get published. In the leading journals, they probably have an acceptance rate of 5 to 10%. So 9 out of every 10 papers submitted get rejected. Yeah. So as we'll find out after lunch, you need to be resilient and robust, because all of us find papers turned down by journals. Okay, so I think we can move on to the first session now. So we've got the morning to discuss the sort of why questions, and then after lunch, the how questions. We're going to work through to about midday. So it's now, what, 9:30. We've got about 2.5 hours, but maybe we'll take a break. Yeah, I think that probably makes sense, doesn't it? After maybe at 10:30, have coffee? Yeah. Yeah? Okay, so we'll go for about an hour, then we'll have a break, then we'll come back for another hour. It's too much to expect you to translate for 2 hours. Okay. If we move on to the next slide. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw on some papers that have been recently published. So with Dr. Locke, we're working on a grant, a Wellcome Trust grant, looking at extreme weather and outdoor work in Vietnam. And there were a series of papers published in Urban Studies, which is a leading international journal on extreme heat in Asia. And some of them are on the slide here, from Bangkok, Doha, China, India, and so forth. So I'll draw on these papers to illustrate the points that I'm making. Yeah. And they're just appropriate given the project that Dr. Locke and I are working on at the moment. So the first question on the next slide is kind of what are the building blocks of a paper? So what are the essential components that make up a paper? It sort of varies between journals and between disciplines, but nonetheless, I think we can identify a set of components that very commonly comprise a paper. And I suppose that's the most straightforward, simple place to start. So if we move on. Okay, so here are the building blocks. I'll talk about the introduction and how you set up a paper in just a moment, but you can see here we've got the introduction, methods, field context, empirical results, theory, conceptual framing, literature review, policy elements, discussion, and conclusion. Those are the elements which many papers will have in them. Not all of them, but probably a significant proportion. This is the, if you like, these building blocks set up the what, where, how, when, and most important of all, and we'll come on to it, the why. I review lots of papers, maybe about a paper every 2 weeks I review. And I think the most common question I have as a reviewer is, so what? Yeah, why am I reading this paper? It might be a fascinating study of outdoor workers in Cantor, but so what? What's the point? Yeah. And this is what I call in this presentation the whyness question. Yeah. Why this paper for this journal? And as you'll see in a moment, that answering that why question can be theoretical, it can be policy linked, yeah, it could be an empirical puzzle. But that, I think, is the most important thing that we need to consider. Yeah. Why should someone be interested in my paper? I mean, you'll see on the right-hand side of this slide, I've got some things to note, which essentially is to make the point that I imagine you're all working in different subject areas, and different disciplines, different subjects have different conventions for arguing their case, for presenting their evidence. In some subjects, there's a very clear sequence of elements to a paper, particularly in the natural sciences. So when I write papers in the natural sciences, there's almost a set series of steps. I think in the humanities, it's looser. So you'll know your own disciplinary conventions. And I recognize that some of the things I say today, you might be thinking, well, that doesn't really apply for cultural studies or for languages and literatures. Yep. So I'm realizing, I'm accepting that there is this variation. So when we move on to the introduction, but before I do that, are there any questions that people have? Things that you would like me to explain or expand at this point? Okay, so we'll start at the beginning with the introduction. Yeah, so how you set up a paper, how do you draw the reader in, and what needs to be in the introduction? Okay, so I think introductions comprise all of these kind of questions that I've got down on this slide here. So kind of what is a paper about? Where, if it's appropriate, is it located? When was it taken, or what period does it refer to? How was it undertaken in terms of, say, the methods? And as I said earlier, also why you might want to read it. So why is it important? Why is it significant? What does it do in terms of developing our knowledge about a particular issue? So what I've got now is 2 sets of extracts from some of those papers I talked about earlier. So what I want to do is to give you some examples of how scholars have done it. So you can see here in English, the opening sentences from this paper: Thermal Governance, Urban Metabolism and Carbonized Comfort, Air Conditioning and Urbanization in the Gulf and Doha. And what I've done is extracted sentences from the introduction to show the way in which this introduction addresses that how, where, what, why set of questions. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll read it out in English, and you can follow the Vietnamese up on the screen. Yeah, and then we'll kind of look at what the author has been doing in terms of set the paper up. So if I'll read the English, and hopefully the Vietnamese, will be the translation of the English. This has led to an emerging scholarship in urban planning that focuses on urban heat governance. This scholarship is, however, primarily concerned with how the discipline of urban planning might address heat hazards in contemporary North American contexts. In contrast, this paper takes a broader interdisciplinary, historical, and global approach to understanding the governance of heat by developing the concept of thermal governance. As the climate crisis is a planetary one, it is crucial to at least go beyond North America to understand other less studied parts of the world, especially those in the hotter regions of the world. Through this connected concept of thermal governance, this paper examines the case of the urbanization of Doha from the 1950s to the 1980s. So that's the Vietnamese on the screen. I don't read Vietnamese, so I'm assuming it kind of mirrors what I just read out in English. And if we now just sort of look at what the author was doing when it came to the introduction. Yeah, this one. Yeah. Okay, so if we kind of work through each of the bullets in turn, you can see that the first extract it addresses whyness. So it says, this scholarship is primarily concerned with how the discipline of urban planning might address heat hazards in contemporary North American contexts. So it's identifying a gap. The author is saying that this issue has been done in North America, but it hasn't been done in sort of countries outside North America. And that's the justification for the paper. So that is a whyness claim, yeah, why this paper is important. Okay, so that's the first bullet. The second bullet is a kind of whatness. It begins to develop what the paper is about. It's an interdisciplinary, historical, and global approach to understanding the governance of heat by developing the concept of thermal governance. So what the author has done then, having said why it's important, the author is then expanding upon what it is about. Okay, then we move on to the third bullet on this slide. And again, the author's returning once more to the whyness question. And the author says, as the climate crisis is a planetary one, it is crucial to at least go beyond North America to understand other less studied parts of the world, especially in the hotter regions of the world. Yeah, so what the author again is kind of reiterating the point that if the climate crisis is global, planetary, then we can't just assume that Phoenix, Arizona is going to be the same as Can Tho in southern Vietnam. Yeah, we need to look at Can Tho because it might be different from Phoenix, Arizona. Yeah, so what the author is doing here, again, is reiterating this point that somehow there's a gap in our understanding of extreme heat and thermal governance. And that is why this paper, the author claims, is important. And then the last sentence right at the bottom of this slide provides a sort of summary statement of howness, whereness, and whenness. So through this connective concept of thermal governance, so that's the how, yeah, that's the conceptual kind of framing. This paper examines the case of urbanization of Doha from the 1950s to the 1980s. So the reader immediately knows how the scholar is intending to explore this issue, where they're doing it, Doha, and over what period, from the 1950s to the 1980s. Yeah. So it means that at the end of this introduction for this paper, and I'm happy to share the papers if you wanted to look at them, but at the end of the introduction, the reader knows why this paper is important, how it's being done, where it's being done, and what period it covers. Right, we'll move on to a second introduction now. And then at the end of this, we'll see if there are any questions that you've got about the introduction. So this second paper, and usefully, we've got the English and the Vietnamese on the same slide, so that's good. This paper is called Unequal and Unjust, the Political Ecology of Bangkok's Increasing Urban Heat Island. So obviously on Bangkok, and again, it's on extreme heat. And I've extracted 2 sentences from the introduction. As before, I'll just read them out, and then we can kind of look at what they're doing. Heat waves have become a serious global public health threat. Between 1998 and 2017, heat waves resulted in more fatalities globally than all other environmental hazards, with some groups particularly vulnerable. This paper examines the impact of urban heat islands in Bangkok, the capital of Thailand, through a political ecology perspective with particular reference to the city's limited green space, since few such studies currently exist in Asia. So if we just kind of look at those sentences, the first one addresses whyness, whenness, and whatness, does all 3 of those things. So heat waves have become a serious global public health threat. Yeah, so that's a claim for importance, for significance. More people are dying from extreme heat than any other natural hazard. The implication is this is something we need to understand. It has policy significance. And then goes on to exemplify that. Between 1998 and 2017, heat waves resulted in more fatalities than all other environmental hazards, with some groups particularly vulnerable. So it's unequally distributed. So I think that those 2 sentences address why, when, 1998 and 2017, and what they're looking at. And the last bullet on this slide, again, I'll read it out. We'll just sort of think about what the author is doing. This paper examines the impact of urban heat islands in Bangkok, the capital of Thailand, through a political ecology perspective, with particular reference to the city's limited green space, since few such studies currently exist in Asia. So we look at that, you'll see it's once again making a claim for whyness. It's saying few such studies currently exist in Asia. That's the classic why sort of claim, which is a claim based on a gap in the literature. Yeah, we don't know about this, and we need to know about it. It's also, in that sentence, got whereness and howness. He's looking at Bangkok and green space, and it's using a political ecology perspective. So political ecology is the how. Bangkok and green space is the where, and the few such studies currently exist is the why. So in that sentence, it's kind of covering 3 of the bases that often you would want to see in an introduction. Okay. Right, should we just sort of stop there for a moment, see if there are any questions you've got? I mean, hopefully you can see what I'm suggesting you need to get into your introduction, and of which I think the most important and difficult part is this point about establishing the why. I mean, I'll come back to this later in this morning's session, but if we're working on, a case study from Vietnam, yeah, why should someone living in the UK or France or Australia or Thailand, why should they be interested in a case from Vietnam? Yeah. So you can see in these 2 introductions, one from Doha, and one from Bangkok, that the authors of each are arguing that even if you're not interested in Thailand or Doha, Qatar, these papers are important. So maybe we'll see if there are any questions on this and deal with them. If not, we can move on. But
Dạ, phần quan trọng nhất ở trong introduction là mình phải giải thích được cái lý do tại sao mà một cái nghiên cứu ở Việt Nam hay là ở Bangkok nó có thể thu hút được cái gọi là cái sự quan tâm của độc giả ở những quốc gia khác. Nhưng mà ví dụ trường hợp một cái nghiên cứu của mình nó quá là bản địa đi, nghiên cứu ở một cái thôn nào đó ở đồng bằng sông Cửu Long, hay là đặc biệt là những cái dự án nghiên cứu của SocialLife thì nó rất là kiểu regional, nó rất là thuộc về phạm vi khu vực, và cái vấn đề nó không có mang tính toàn cầu ấy, thì liệu cái khả năng những cái công bố này nó có thể đưa ra quốc tế được hay không? Ví dụ như ở Đại học Văn hóa hay Đại học Xã hội Nhân văn thì sẽ có những cái nghiên cứu mà chỉ là về một cái nét văn hóa nào đó rất là đặc trưng của một cái vùng miền rất là nhỏ ở trong một khu vực thôi, thì cái khả năng để công bố quốc tế của những cái nghiên cứu này là có hay không? Cảm ơn.
yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah. So how do we make our case relevant for people who maybe are just not interested in the Mekong Delta? Yeah, they've never been here. They're not interested. Why should they read, say, a paper from Social Life? Yeah. And I mean, it will come up later. I'll look at how we develop a case. So how do we take something really very local, quite specific, and how do we generalize from it? And if you look at some of the, the great scholars, people like James C. Scott, his Weapons of the Week is based on one village in Malaysia, Sedeka, yeah, a single village. And I would say that any scholars working on agrarian change in anywhere in the world will know Jim Scott's work, even though it's on one village. So the question is, how did he do that? How did he manage to take the experience of one village in Kedah in Malaysia and make that village something that, someone working in Latin America or Africa would wish to read? Yep. And if we kind of sort of remember your question, it'll come up later when we talk about the case. Yeah. So how do we generalize from the specific? And that is a real challenge because, I mean, if you work on the US, you're okay. Everyone thinks the United States is important, is significant. I mean, I work on Brunei sometimes. People don't think Brunei is interesting or significant. So how do we take a case from Brunei and sort of publish it in an international journal so that people anywhere in the world might wish to read it? So maybe we'll keep your question because it will come back in the later part of the presentation, but it's a critical one. I move on to the next section, making the paper compelling. And I've got kind of 5 ways in which, I mean, there may be more than 5, but I've got down 5 ways in which people do this. First way is to present something as puzzling, counterintuitive, surprising. Yeah. That's one way in which scholars draw us into an example, say a case that maybe SocialLife is working on here in the Mekong. Something that you think, wow, I didn't think it would be like that. Yeah. And something puzzling immediately grabs our attention. So that's one way in which some papers draw us into the discussion, make the context, the argument compelling. So the second way is through making a case for importance. So in other words, it could be important in policy terms. And you saw that in some of the introductions, people which we just worked through, scholars, authors saying, you know, more people are killed from extreme heat than any other natural hazard. That's a claim for importance based on policy significance. So that's the second way in which people make a paper compelling. The third way, maybe the most obvious, is to say that something hasn't been done before. So this is that classic gap argument, which came through in some of the discussions we had earlier, that no one has looked at this issue in Vietnam, in Asia, in Ho Chi Minh City. Yep. And therefore we need to address it. So that gap argument is one that crops up quite a lot. Fourth thing that I think people do, scholars, authors, academics, is a claim for timeliness. That, I mean, if you think about COVID and what happened to COVID, is that was a perfect time to publish a paper on social distancing, on government policies to address COVID and so on. So there are moments when either an event, a change in government, a new policy, something offers us an opportunity to write a paper that before that event or before that policy didn't exist. So sometimes there's a timeliness argument. And I suppose a sort of perfect example of that was the COVID pandemic. And it offered, I don't know whether SocialLife undertook any research during the COVID pandemic or afterwards, but there's an opportunity there tied to a particular moment in time. And the final justification for a paper that you see in the literature is that someone challenges the received wisdom on a topic. They say, well, scholars up until now have argued this, I'm going to argue something different. Yeah. So in other words, you're reversing the normal argument, or at least you're challenging the normal way in which something is viewed. So, so what I've got here is a kind of sort of a summary of those different ways in which scholars have tried to address this why, question to make a paper important and worth reading. So I call each of them, you can see I've got the surprise argument at the top, then the significance or importance argument, the gap argument, the timeliness argument, and the contrarian argument. Yep. Each of those, I think, are slightly different ways in which scholars, researchers, authors of a paper make the importance of their paper, the significance of their paper clear to the reader. So what I've done here, we'll show you the Vietnamese version in just a moment, but this is the extract from one of the papers. I've got the title of the paper at the bottom, and I've shown how the author has linked their paper to one of those different arguments. So yes, if we look at this, so I've highlighted the bits. I mean, I'll read them from the English and hopefully they'll corresponding to the Vietnamese. So the intensity of heat waves brought about by climate change have made the governance of heat, especially in the hotter regions of the world, even more urgent. Yep. So that's that's an importance. Yeah. Urgency. We need to know about this. However, scholarship is primarily concerned with how the discipline of urban planning might address heat hazards in contemporary North American contexts. That's a gap argument. Yeah, it's saying we need to know more about this, but up until now, people have just looked at North America. What about other parts of the world? This particular paper is on Doha. And then at the bottom, at the end of it, you can see a contrarian argument coming through. by showing the different histories and rationales behind the management of heat. Thermal governance situates air conditioning as part of a larger socio-technical assembly and trajectory, thereby avoiding the techno-determinism in current discourse on air conditioning and the warming planet. Yeah, so what we've got here, I think, in these extracts, translated into Vietnamese, is the author deploying three claims for significance. One based on importance from a policy point of view, one in terms of a gap that we don't know this and we need to know it, and the third is a contrarian argument. So we'll sort of continue where we left off. I've got one other example of how a pair of authors, Danny Marks and John Connell, make their claims for significance. So if we look at this, you can see that, well, they open their paper by saying, heat waves have become a serious global public health threat. So that is saying this is important. Yep. Not just locally, but globally. So although this is on Bangkok, they're saying that Bangkok opens up something which is of wider importance, because this is a global issue, not just a local issue. And then they go on to identify a gap. So I've highlighted again the two elements of this. Few studies currently exist in Asia on this topic. Our paper, therefore, seeks to address this gap. So very explicitly, they're saying this is something that we need to look at, that currently there hasn't been work done on this particular theme, and we're doing it. And finally, they hint at a contrarian argument here, right at the end of this extract. They say uneven urban thermal environments do not only exist in the present and can be easily resolved through planning and engineering, but rather are products of social and political processes spanning decades. So what they're doing here is that they're arguing that to understand extreme heat is not, and the vulnerabilities that arise from extreme heat, we need to track back deep into history to understand why those social groups are vulnerable. It's not just because of climate change now, it's because of policies in the past. So they're sort of hinting that they're taking a different perspective from other papers. So those two examples, both drawn from the papers that I started with in this journal, Urban Studies, I think sort of both of them hopefully show the way in which these authors make this claim for significance. And that then, I think, raises the question that Anne asked in the break, which is about how do we make our cases important? How do we take an example from Cantor and ensure that someone who never been to Cantor, isn't interested in Vietnam, maybe doesn't even work on Asia, somehow will find that of importance? So that's what we're moving on to now. How do we make a case for our case? All right, so here we're investigating that question that Anne asked earlier about, the case. So yesterday we were in Cantor. We were interviewing people selling lottery tickets in Cantor Market. Yeah. How can we make those individual stories into a paper that other people might want to read? Yeah. How do we do that? And so that's what I want to talk about for the next 20 minutes or so. So what is a case? I've got a quote from a really lovely paper by an anthropologist at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark called Christian Lund. His paper is entitled "Of What Is This a Case?" And I'll just read out the English, and you can see the Vietnamese in front of you. A case is an edited chunk of empirical reality where certain features are marked out, emphasized, and privileged, while others recede into the background. As such, a case is not natural, but a mental or analytical construct aimed at organizing knowledge about reality in a manageable way. Now, I don't know if the Vietnamese kind of captures that, but it's saying that, of course, with all our cases, what we're doing is we are framing them according to the questions we're asking. Yeah. So reality, the empirical example, whether it's a lottery seller or a tourist experience or kind of whatever it is, we are selecting certain features and emphasizing them and pushing others into the background as a way of organizing knowledge for the task at hand. Okay, so how do we do how that process of distillation? How does it happen? And I think we sometimes do it according to four approaches, and you can see them on the slide here. Sometimes it's theory driven. So we have a theory of social change, of marginalization, which then helps us organize knowledge. It may be problem driven. So there's a problem of poverty, and that might be a way that helps us organize knowledge. It may be policy driven. So we're looking at a particular policy, say of the Vietnamese government, and that helps us. Or it may be data driven. There may be some data which is helping us organize our case. So let's look at, again, if we go back to the papers that I selected from the Urban Studies Journal, let's look at the way in which they have done this. So how have they used theory, policy, data to help frame their case? So what I've done here is I've, again, extracted sentences from the papers that we're talking about to show the way in which theory, problem, policy, or data helps them make the case for their case, whether it's on Doha or Bangkok or China or Vietnam, of course. So the first one here is theory driven. And in English, the quote is, "We begin to outline a theory of shade by exploring how outdoor, informal, and precariously employed workers negotiate their rights and access to shade in an increasingly hot city." So this paper by Maktoum and others, they are using a theory of shade as a way of exploring this particular issue. That's helping them to organize their case. And then the second one is problem driven. Maybe this is kind of easier to see. So again, the extract from the paper where it says, it's crucial to go beyond North America to understand other less studied parts of the world that are projected to have even higher temperatures, making them even more challenging to inhabit. So here, it's a problem which is helping them organize their case. And then I'll do the next two together. We've got the policy driven and the data driven. And again, I've got extracts from the papers. So I think in all four of these examples, we've got the authors using different ways in which they can organize their empirical material, whether it's according to theory, problem, policy, or data. And I think most papers have these sorts of frameworks which help them, if like, select what it is in a case that they want to take forward. It's the means by which we structure our empirical material so that that material lends itself to the argument we're trying to take forward. Okay, so hopefully that may have answered, at least in part, Anne's question about how we take a local case and make it speak to broader debates. We do it through policy, problem, theory, and data. Yeah. And of course, that then links back to the earlier discussion of significance. So why is our paper significant? Why is our case, our example, significant? And those two things are obviously connected. So I don't know whether, well, we'll get a translation of that in a moment, but if there are questions as well, maybe before we move on to the next section. Move on to, how we go from description to analysis, yeah, in a paper. Yeah, I think one way of thinking about this is thinking about the connections between, if you like, the specific and the general, and the concrete and the abstract. And I think most of our studies have all four of these elements. So the specific and the general, obviously the specific is local, is case-based, but it will also relate to some general propositions. And we will also have concrete evidence, so empirical material, as well as abstract ideas. And I think in many of our studies, we're moving between those four sort of parts of an argument, the specific and the general, the concrete and the abstract. So we look at this slide here. I've got sort of examples of, in relation to the work we're doing with SocialLife. We've got two types of concrete examples, one quite specific, the other rather more general. So we might say that a specific example at the concrete level would be pregnant women, yeah, as a group that we're interested in. At a more general level, we might say we're interested in the poor. Not all pregnant women are poor, but some are. Many of the poor, of course, goes beyond pregnant women. So what we have there is two concrete groups that we might wish to explore as part of our study. And then on the right-hand side of the matrix, we've got two abstract ideas, vulnerability and climate justice. Pregnant women and the poor are vulnerable in different ways. I mean, vulnerability is a concept. It's constructed in different ways by different scholars in different fields, yeah? So it's the way that we apply an abstract concept to the concrete examples of pregnant women and the poor that we might be looking at in a particular case, like Cantor. And then also in here, so the sort of bottom right-hand quadrat of the matrix, you can see I've got climate justice. So this is another abstract idea of a more general nature, that when we look at around the world, we see examples of climate injustice, whether at a national level or experienced through, say, the poor in Cantor or pregnant women in Cantor. So what we're doing here is, as I say, we've got a set of concrete empirics and a set of abstract ideas, and we're trying to connect up the concrete with the abstract, both in specific ways and sometimes in more general ways. So this is what kind of Christian Lund again says about this process. He says, one is constantly, by one he means us scholars, scholars are constantly sometimes seemingly aimlessly moving back and forth between observation, generalization, abstraction, and theorization. So those four elements in the matrix, we're taking our empirical material we collected through interviews or focus group discussions or surveys. We're attaching that to abstractions, both general and specific, as a way of taking forward an argument that addresses the questions that inform the paper or the book that we're writing. On this slide, you can see I've got the, if you like, the four elements. We've got theory at the top, got empirical results, and we've got the analysis and interpretation. The sort of balance between these three will reflect the justification for the paper. So if a paper is theory driven, then the top part of this triangle will be emphasized. If it's more of a problem driven or a policy driven paper, then the empirical results will probably be more important and the theory will probably sit in the background. So how we sort of navigate this triangle will link back to some of the earlier discussion this morning. Yeah, what is it that we're emphasizing? Theory, problem, policy, or data? So does anyone have any questions? We've got one short section to go, but are there any questions on that?
Khi nãy cô có nói đến là về 4 vấn đề mà thầy nêu, thì đó là thứ nhất là lý thuyết, thứ nhì là vấn đề, thứ ba là chính sách và thứ tư là dữ liệu. Nếu vậy thì em thấy cả cái này hình như nó đều là dữ liệu hết à. Vậy nó có bị trùng ý với nhau hay không ạ? File dịch đó là slide số 40 hả? Dạ, khi nãy đó là đang nói thì cô có đưa lên lại cái vấn đề là bốn vấn đề mà thầy đã nêu hả?
Ở chỗ này, đây này.
Yeah, lý thuyết, vấn đề, chính sách và dữ liệu, thì em thấy cả 4 cái thì nó đều là dữ liệu hết à. Ý em muốn nói đó là nó giống nhau, nó là một ý à. Thì tại sao lại đưa ra 4 khái niệm? Tức là ở 4 khái niệm là lý thuyết, vấn đề, chính sách và dữ liệu, thì cả 4 cái này thì nó đều là dữ liệu, tức là chỉ cần có một khái niệm là dữ liệu thôi, thay vì mình phải là chia ra làm 4 khái niệm mà.
Yes, I mean, in an individual paper, it doesn't have to do all four things. I was saying that normally each paper will have at least one of these justifications, sometimes more than one, but rarely all four. So yeah, so I wasn't suggesting that every paper should have theory, problem, policy, data, but rather that papers will take at least one of these as a way of justifying their case. Yeah. But one other thing is that these four ways in which papers are driven or justified, I think there may be others. These are four. When I was putting together this presentation and looking at the papers in urban studies, these were the justifications that I identified, but there may be some others as well that I haven't managed to identify. But I think this probably covers many of the papers that we address, that they probably come under one or more of these justifications.
Em muốn thử xác nhận lại xem là cái cách hiểu của em về 4 cái driven này nó hợp lý hay không. Thì có thể là thông qua đó thầy giải thích lại, thì cũng có thể làm rõ thêm cái câu hỏi của chị và xem là em có bị hiểu nhầm hay không. Thì 4 cái động cơ này tức là 4 cái khía cạnh để mà mình có thể nâng tầm một cái hiện tượng xã hội hay là một cái hiện tượng văn hóa gì đó mà mình đang nghiên cứu thành thật sự là một cái case điển hình để mà mình có thể công bố ra quốc tế được. Thì cái khía cạnh thứ nhất là cái theory, là từ cái lý thuyết, tức là từ một cái vấn đề rất là địa phương, thì mình phải tìm được cái khung lý thuyết mà ở trên thế giới hiện nay người ta đang công nhận, để mà thông qua đó lý giải được cái case này, thì mình có thể làm giàu thêm được cái lý thuyết đó. Thì đó là cái cách tiếp cận thứ nhất, tức là mượn một cái lý thuyết ở trên thế giới để biến cái vấn đề nghiên cứu của mình mang tính phổ quát hơn. Hoặc là cái cách tiếp cận thứ hai là tiếp cận từ cái vấn đề. Thì cái vấn đề ở đây á, mình phải tìm ra được cái mối tương quan giữa một cái vấn đề rất là nhỏ ở địa phương nhưng mà nó mang tính toàn cầu. Ví dụ nghiên cứu về người lao động ngoài trời ở Việt Nam thì nó chính là một trong những cái chi tiết hay là một cái sự kiện ở trong một cái bức tranh lớn hơn là cái vấn đề biến đổi khí hậu ở trên thế giới. Thì đó chính là cái problem driven của mình. Cái thứ ba là cái policy driven, là mình, tức là cái nghiên cứu của mình chỉ mang tính là lý giải lý thuyết á, thì nó sẽ là cái theory driven, mà mang tính là làm rõ vấn đề thì sẽ là problem driven, hay là nghiên cứu của mình hướng đến tìm ra một cái recommendation, cái giải pháp hay là cái đề xuất chính sách gì đó để giải quyết cái vấn đề, nhưng mà cái vấn đề nó cũng phải là mang tính toàn cầu thì mới mang ra công bố được. Hay là cái yếu tố thứ tư là cái data driven, tức là một cái vấn đề đó nó cũng phải mang tính toàn cầu nhưng mà nó bị thiếu một cái dữ liệu ở cái địa phương của mình. Thì tại sao cái địa phương của mình nên được nghiên cứu? Ví dụ như đồng bằng sông Cửu Long chẳng hạn, nó có một cái mối liên quan gì với những cái ví dụ nằm trong nhóm các quốc gia đang phát triển chẳng hạn, nhưng mà người ta đã nghiên cứu về những cái quốc gia khác rồi và còn thiếu cái dữ liệu ở đồng bằng sông Cửu Long này, thì mình muốn mang cái data này ra công bố quốc tế. Thì em không biết là cái cách mà em hiểu như thế về 4 cái cách tiếp cận này nó có đúng hay không?
Yeah, I think I mean Anne's right. I suppose it's I mean often these things are connected. Yeah. That there's a problem, there's a policy, there's a theory, and there's some data as well. But often we sort of privilege one or the other. Yeah. So, for example, sort of policy driven. Yeah. We could say we'd be looking at Doi Moi here in Vietnam. Yeah. The policy of renovation, Doi Moi. Yeah. We look at that specifically as a policy. What did it do in Vietnam? What did it do in rural areas or in urban areas? What did it mean for poor people or rich people? What happened to inequality? Yep. But it's the policy of Doi Moi which drives our paper. Yep. Or it could be a problem like, sort of female-headed households. So households where elderly women's husbands have died. Yeah. So I imagine SocialLife probably look at that. Yeah. How do female-headed households manage when they are young, sort of elderly women on their own? There's a problem there. Yeah. There's probably policies as well, but we're looking at the problem rather than the policy. Yeah. So I think for each of these 4 ways of thinking about a paper, it's which one we put at the center of our paper. Are we looking at a problem, a policy? Are we examining a theory? Or do we have new data that we want to understand? Yep. So, I mean, to give you an example, here in Vietnam, I think I'm right in saying that total fertility rates are below replacement levels. Yeah. So kind of women are having fewer than 2 children each. Is that right?
Yeah, 2?
Less than 2.
No, 2.
2.
Usually 2.
Think, yeah, which is less than replacement. So we have data on fertility rates. Is that a problem? Yeah. Low population growth. What are the policies that the Vietnamese government have for encouraging people to have more children? Yep. And what theories of demographic transition do we apply to that? So something like the fertility transition in Vietnam has all 4 of these elements that we've got on the slide. but which one we use as our entry point will vary. Could be theory, problem, policy, or data. Okay.
Ở cái câu hỏi của chị mà có 4 cái đó có gọi chung là dữ liệu được hay không ấy, thì em nghe thầy thì thầy nói như thế này này, tức là cái 4 cái đấy nó đều là dữ liệu, nhưng mà một cái là dữ liệu thứ cấp và một cái là dữ liệu định tính định lượng. Dữ liệu thứ cấp là chị trước một cái hiện tượng của xã hội mà chị cần nghiên cứu, nó là đối tượng nghiên cứu, thì chị sẽ dựa vào cái khung lý thuyết nào, nó là cơ sở lý thuyết. Thế sau đó thì dựa vào khung lý thuyết đó thì sau đó chị lại nghĩ là vậy cái khung lý thuyết đó nó như thế nào đối với những cái chính sách tại cái quốc gia sở tại mình đang sinh sống đó, và thấy được cái hiện tượng xã hội đó để nghiên cứu. Thì từ cơ sở lý thuyết và cơ sở chính sách pháp lý đấy, thì mình mới đưa ra là mình sẽ khảo sát cái gì để đưa ra dữ liệu định tính và định lượng. Vậy thì một bài nghiên cứu nó sẽ có cả là sự kết hợp của các yếu tố lại với nhau, chứ nó không hề tách ra. Chị nghiên cứu bất cứ một vấn đề gì thì chị cũng phải dựa vào khung lý thuyết. Chị nghiên cứu bất cứ một cái gì cũng phải dựa trên chính sách tại cái bản địa, cái cơ sở, cái địa phương đó như thế nào. Rồi chị mới khảo sát là codebook hay là questionnaire đối với cái dữ liệu định tính định lượng. Và từ cái kết quả của dữ liệu thì chị mới phản hồi ngược lại rằng là cái lý thuyết này đúng hết không? Tôi bổ sung cái gì cho lý thuyết này? Và chính sách này cần thay đổi cái gì? Thì tự nhiên cái bài quốc tế của chị sẽ được nâng tầm lên. Cái đại ý là như thế.
Yes, absolutely. My most cited paper is on northeast Thailand. It's on one village in Thailand, and it was published in a journal called World Development, and I think it's been cited 1,200 times. Yeah, most of the people who refer to that study aren't interested in Thailand, but I'm making an argument about the connection between land and poverty. That's the general point I'm making, but I do it through the experience of 2 villages in a place called Mahasarakam in northeast Thailand. And so far, I think around about 1,200 people, scholars, have cited my paper because there's something in there. And of course, most of them aren't interested in Thailand. They're not interested in Asia. So that's our challenge as scholars, is to make our case on Cantor, on Ho Chi Minh City, or whatever it is, of interest and relevance and significance to scholars working in other areas, in other fields. And I suppose what I've been trying to do this morning is to show the way in which we do that. Yep. There are certain techniques that we have for presenting our evidence and our material in ways that draw in readers, an audience from other areas, maybe even from other subjects, to read our paper, and then hopefully to cite it. I think you need to return to the question of significance. So why the paper is important. I think it's important also to reflect on what a paper has not been able to do. So what are the aspects of the issue that for whatever reason you're not been able to address? And finally, you need to kind of round things off so that the paper has a sense of an ending to it. And I think those are the 4 things that you need to do in a good conclusion. So, yeah, we'll go. Well, do you have, I know we ended the last session with a few questions, but are there any final questions you'd like to ask me before we move on to the sort of nuts and bolts of publishing? So which journal, how, and that sort of thing.